Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So 8 years ago, Nathan VanderKlippe was covering energy in Alberta, but he'd always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And then he got his chance. He thought his new assignment was going to be in South America, but then the Globe asked him if he'd be interested in going to China. It was a big assignment, and he said yes. This was in 2013, just as Xi Jinping came into power. Since then, China's gone through one of the greatest transformations in its history and become a major player on the world stage.
We see a much greater degree of skepticism, of leeriness of speaking with foreign journalists. There's just a sense that so much is now considered sensitive in China.
Nathan's leaving China and his post as Asia correspondent at the end of the month, so we wanted to talk to him about the changes that he's seen, what it's been like to be a journalist in China as the government's been cracking down on press freedom, and what he thinks China's future holds. That's today on The Decibel. Hi, Nathan. This is an enormous beat, and I imagine the last few years have been thrilling and stressful and tiring at times. How are you feeling right now as you're about to leave this job?
I mean, it's a hard job to leave, to be honest. It's so interesting because there's so much that's taking place. The issues are huge. When you look at the combination in China of their economic power, of their political and international ambition, and all of these things, it just feels like, this is a place that is the center of some perhaps quite significant change in how the world operates. Leaving that behind, I have to say, is more than a little bittersweet.
Yeah, I can imagine. And when you first landed in Beijing in 2013, I think China was also kind of at a historical inflection point at that time, too. China was at the center of a lot of geopolitical tension, going through a transformational period domestically, too. It was a big assignment, right? How did you prepare yourself?
I think I mostly just sort of experienced long moments of terror. and in many ways, I regretted that I was sent to China. I'd always wanted to go overseas. I'd always been interested. I was born overseas, and I was interested in working overseas. And I mean, it's just that you prepare for a foreign assignment the way you prepare for any assignment. You read as much as you can. And I studied Mandarin before I came here. I continue to study Mandarin after I came here. It's not anywhere near where I would like it to be, but it's good enough that I can conduct interviews in Chinese and sort of communicate with people in Chinese and written and oral forms. So it's not pretty, but it's functional. And in fact, I think that's gotten a lot more important, to be honest.
And what was the local perception, do you think, of a Western journalist like yourself covering China for a Western newspaper? What do you think people thought of you?
I mean, well, the Globe's been in China since 1959, so the idea of a foreign correspondent isn't entirely new in China. And the cities like Beijing and Shanghai, in most places, foreigners don't even get a second look because, there have been significant enough foreign populations for long enough. But I always found one of the interesting things about China, particularly in the first few years, was how it was a place where it was very difficult to secure information through official channels, and remarkably easy to secure information at the ground level. And there's a real openness when you travel and when you speak with people outside of official channels, when you go into the countryside, when you do these sorts of things, there's often a real openness by people to speak about their lives. Like I said, some of that is changing, and it's changing as part of, some of these much bigger, you could say almost tectonic shifts in terms of a skepticism and in some places a hostility towards foreigners. And certainly in academia in China, in the corporate sector in China, we see a much greater degree of skepticism, of leeriness of speaking with foreign journalists. There's just a sense that so much is now considered sensitive in China that for people to speak out on something has very little upside in terms of speaking to the foreign media, and potentially has a significant downside. And so as a result, it's tough. I mean, I sometimes like to say that the hardest thing to do in China as a journalist is to get a political scientist to talk about politics.
That's so interesting. And that has gotten worse over time since you've been there, that level of trust. Yeah,
very obviously so. And it's across the board. I mean, journalists swap stories about long-time sources and contacts, actually just deleting them off WeChat. WeChat is sort of the universal chat app here, so that they can't be reached anymore. And it's unfortunate because it means that we end up not hearing, I think, as much from the Chinese side as we would like to hear. When what you end up with instead, which of course is exactly the point, is the official perspective. And I suspect at least part of that is because some of that robust exchange of discussions is being lost. I mean, there's a powerful leader in China, and there is an unwillingness to be seen to be saying anything that might be considered dissonant with what is coming out of the center.
You mentioned that you had to learn Mandarin. I imagine you had help at the beginning and that you've worked with Chinese journalists, right? Did you have help with your reporting?
We work with a Chinese journalist. The Chinese government insists that we call them news assistants, but they are, in fact, very skilled journalists. So in terms of navigating the system, navigating language and that sort of thing, we work together on those sorts of things, myself and my colleague Alexandra Lee, who's just terrific and a real asset to the Globe here. There's been a real increase in pressure by the Chinese government on some of these Chinese staff, most of whom, in terms of those working for foreign media in Beijing, have been called in over the last few months and ordered to sign some agreement acknowledging their commitment to following the letter of the law in China on their policies on foreign journalists and that sort of thing, which, of course, I would not ask my colleague to not follow that law, but the idea that you are hauling people in to specifically have them sign something can be seen as an intimidation tactic.
So I'm curious about how Alexandra works and how she helps you. And I guess my question is, what kind of freedoms do you think you have that Chinese journalists don't have?
Well, I would say in general, the biggest freedom I have is the freedom to leave. Mm-hmm. And the biggest constraint that Chinese journalists have is that they don't have that same freedom. They're on Chinese credentials. They're on Chinese passports, which can be, of course, canceled by the Chinese government. And not only that, but they have families here. And China very often uses family pressure to try to exert influence upon people. You can have police show up at your family's door, or you can have a father or mother who loses a job, or, the consequences can be quite significant.
You've been covering the detention of Uyghurs in northwestern China for several years now. Do you remember when or how you first heard about it?
So I made my first trip to Xinjiang in 2014. There were elements that were taking shape around 2014, around bans on certain form of dress, bans of beards on younger men, not sort of older men, but younger working age men, bans on facial covering for women. And there was, in 2014, we now know, some form of what most people in the West call re-education, but it was much, much more limited. And those broader campaigns to, mass incarcerate Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and other peoples and to put them in centers, camps for forcible political indoctrination with a bit of skills training thrown in at the end, that all really kicked off in earnest in 2017. But when I went there in 2014, it was a very different place. And I was able to speak with people in some detail. I was invited into some Uyghur people's homes. I remember staying deep inside the house of one person while they checked to make sure the coast was clear. And so there was a considerable ability at that time to really be able to report and to speak with people, and I think in some ways to gain a more nuanced picture of things. But of course, that was long before, so many people were caught up in all of these forcible measures.
So when you first made that trip, you didn't really have much trouble talking to people. When does that start to change?
Well, I think that starts to change most notably when the following really starts in earnest. And I guess that for me probably started in 2018, 2019. So there was one trip I took where I rented a car outside of Xinjiang and drove in on the hope that I might be able to maintain somewhat of a lower profile, and was picked up within 40 kilometers of entering Xinjiang at a check stop, and was then followed for something like 1,400 kilometers of driving, and it's followed everywhere, followed into the desert in the middle of nowhere, followed to gas stations, everywhere I went, and
wow.
Followed to get breakfast. At one point I got a flat tire that I had to get fixed, and I walked away while they were fixing that to grab myself a bit of breakfast, and some woman was following me at maybe 10 meters behind me. And I remember asking her what she was doing. She's like, "Oh, I'm just on my way." And I'm like, "Yeah, but if I turn, you turn. If I go straight, you turn. You go straight." And she said,
"Yeah,
you have your freedom. I have mine." So I got lectured on liberties from the person following me in Xinjiang.
Wow. So is that what you would do when you knew you were being followed? Like, would you sometimes turn around and just call people out and say, "What are you doing and why are you following me?"
Oh, yeah, for sure. I had another interesting experience, which was in Xinjiang. One of the things that's happened in Xinjiang over a number of years is that gas stations have become fortified encampments. They look, and they're surrounded by sort of walls and razor wire and really thick, heavy metal gates. And to get into them, you need to swipe a Chinese national ID card. And then when you get to the pump itself, you have to swipe it again. And so they track everyone purchasing gas, and they restrict who can purchase gas. And of course, I don't have a Chinese ID card because, I have a passport. And most of the gas stations I went to, a manager might pop out and be like, "Okay, here, let me give you a hand." But I got to one where they wouldn't. And so I got to the front of the line to get in. And of course, I'm like, "Hey, can you help me get in here?" And the person's like, "No, I can't help you get in here." And I was like, "Well, I need gas." And by this point, a line was forming behind me and people were starting to honk. And I was like, "Okay, well, I think I can solve this." So I told the gas station attendant, I was like, just wait a second. I got out of the car and I walked back because on the shoulder of the road, not far away, were parked the people who had been following me. So I knocked on the window and they opened the window, and I was like, "Listen, I need gas and I'm staying here until I get gas. So either you help me or we have an issue where my car doesn't move and a lot of other people can't get gas because I'm blocking the way." And so I got whoever it was that was following me, the state security or whoever it was, to come out and use their card to help me get gas.
Why do they track how people are getting gas? Is that a mobility thing, or what's the deal with that?
My assumption would be that gas could be used as an explosive, but I mean, there are really extraordinary things in Xinjiang. I mean, you can't have a kitchen knife without having your national ID card number engraved into it. And in many places, that kitchen knife needs to be secured with a heavy chain to a table or a countertop or something like that. I mean, the restrictions there are just utterly extraordinary.
You've said that you have a foreign passport and you have this ability to leave, but it has to be scary to be followed like this. Have you ever worried about your safety at any point during any of these encounters with intelligence or law enforcement or whoever it is that's been following you?
I have. My biggest concern in those situations is always who I'm with. The biggest risk is that other people who are seen to be working with me or seen to be talking to me end up being interrogated or much worse. But I would say, strangely, that the biggest concern for me and my safety was I remember I was driving, this was a couple of years ago, and I was driving and state security was following me through Urumqi so closely that I was actually scared that they were going to rear end me and run into me and cause a significant traffic accident. And so I remember at one point in time, I pulled off the road and they came in behind me, and I yelled at them, and I was like, you're driving dangerously and you're putting me at risk here. And I said, and if you do this again, I will stop in the middle of the freeway with you behind me in the middle of traffic. And so they kept following me again. So I slammed on the brakes in the middle of the freeway, in the middle of heavy traffic. And then they ended up pulling back a little.
So what is it like now when you try to talk to people in Xinjiang? I imagine it's pretty different.
Well, I mean, I suppose the simple answer is I don't know, because I and most journalists who go to Xinjiang today don't talk to people. Even if you're not being followed, you have to be concerned about who you're talking to and what the consequences are for those people in talking to you, because we have all kinds of evidence that in the first wave of people who were brought into these re-education centers, or what China calls vocational and skills training centers, that many of them were brought in because of foreign contacts, because they'd spoken with people overseas or they had family overseas. So there's a real, I think, ethical responsibility incumbent upon journalists operating there to try not to create worse circumstances for the people there. But of course, it's a huge quandary, because if you don't talk to people, you're also not giving them the ability to speak out. You're denying them that privilege. As a result, what we end up doing is, to the best we can, observing what we can observe, seeing what we can see, interacting, I suppose, with the authorities and taking pictures of what's there, taking notice of, for example, the co-location of factories with prisons and training centers that are surrounded by electric wire, and then matching that with what we can find through government reports and the reports of people who have managed to get out of Xinjiang in the last couple of years, who can describe what's happened to them.
Yeah, but this difficulty when it comes to talking to Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region, because you interviewing them puts them at risk, the Chinese government has basically used that to deny the accusations of forced labor and genocide, right? And there are people who are still skeptical of the reporting about China's persecution of the Uyghurs, partly because of this and how hard it is to get reliable information from on the ground. And I wonder what you say to those people and what you think of that skepticism still.
Well, I mean, there are elements of what you can see in Xinjiang that you don't have to be on the ground to see. I mean, it's not hard to use Google satellite imagery to scroll back and forth and to see mosques that have been turned into holes in the ground, to see the construction of large facilities that are surrounded by watchtowers and walls and all the rest. I mean, there's, I think if you look at some of the extensive reporting that's been done by researchers, by human rights groups, by journalists, I mean, it's much of it is also heavily founded in Chinese government documents themselves. And one of the deep ironies about China denying all of this is you have officials in Beijing who are there calling things a falsehood when those very things are contained in official government documents.
Do you think the situation for foreign journalists or press freedom generally has gotten worse over time since you've been there?
Well, the community of foreign journalists certainly thinks so. But I mean, I think in very obvious ways, the answer is yes. I mean, we had 17, 18 journalists tossed out of China last year. We've had a real rise in the use of very short-term visas for people. I myself, last year, I spent 7 months on 1-month visas. So I was basically renewing my visa once a month, and it takes 2 weeks to renew that. So I was constantly renewing my visa. And we've also seen in the last year is a real unshackling of the Chinese state-run media to go after journalists in really direct ways. And there has been a constant run of articles in the Chinese press calling out individual foreign journalists for their work and sort of labeling some of their work anti-China or factually unsound. And I mean, it's grown just incredibly ridiculous. I mean, there's an entire narrative now in China that the foreign press uses a gray filter on its images of China to sort of bleach out the colors of the video footage in China. And wow. This is based on a BBC report that was done that ran both in English and in Chinese. I don't know how familiar you are with cameras, but in cameras, you can either have sort of the processed image, or you can basically have a raw, unprocessed image. And the colors in the unprocessed image that come out initially are muted. And they are muted to give you more latitude to sort of draw out detail in the picture and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Anyways, and what happened with the BBC was they edited this piece in RAW and then sent it over to their Chinese service. And the Chinese service ended up just airing it without doing the color correction. So you had two reports. The English report was in bright, vibrant color, and there were the more muted raw colors in the Chinese report. And there was no effort made whatsoever to understand that. And so all of a sudden, the BBC, and by extension, the rest of the foreign media, was accused of using a gray filter on China.
Yeah. So the idea is that foreign journalists are on purpose trying to make China look like this bleak, depressing place.
Right. Exactly.
You've been there almost 8 years at this point. It must feel like home on some level. Why are you leaving?
I mean, I suppose the truth of the matter is it's been a good long posting, and it'd be nice to be a bit closer to family for a while and then see what happens next.
You've covered so many huge stories, from the protests in Hong Kong to China's handling of the pandemic to the detention of the Uyghurs. What do you wish you could have written about in China but didn't get a chance to? And what do you hope your successor will cover that you didn't get a chance to?
I mean, I have to say, when I look back on my time in China, all I can think about is the stuff I didn't do. I have not written as much as I wish I could have about the ways that China is sort of positioning itself in neighboring countries and what that means. I mean, one of the criticisms that foreign journalists often get from people is you're not telling the whole China story. And I mean, it's a fair criticism, because no, I have not told the whole China story. I mean, the fact of the matter is, in a country of 1.4 billion people, that's actually an impossible task. Nobody can tell the whole China story. But it's true that there's an awful lot of ground that gets uncovered, just because it is such a diverse country, and there's just so much happening at any given point in time.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much to Nathan VanderKlippe. You can read his writing on the future of China at theglobeandmail.com. As always, we want to hear from you. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. And most importantly, wherever you listen to podcasts, follow us so you never miss an episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.